In this video, we'll be going over the best types of damage in D&D from a pure numbers standpoint. That means we're looking at the damage types that are immune and resistant to the least. Some of these damage types are harder to deal than others, so don't take this as a be-all, end-all thinking you should choose every spell with a single damage type. Starting us off at number 10, we have non-magical weapon damage. The way we calculate the best damage types was to take the number of creatures resistant to the damage type, subtract the number of creatures vulnerable to it, then divide that by 2, rounding up. Then add the number of creatures immune to the damage to give the damage type a score. The lower the score, the better the damage type. Non-magical weapon damage lumps together all 3 weapon damage types, piercing, bludgeoning, and slashing into one group, because if a monster is immune to one, it's immune to the other 2 as well. There are 198 monsters who are resistant to this damage, and 50 who are immune, while none are vulnerable, giving this a score of 149. When it comes to later on in this list, the 3 weapon damages have been split up, as they all have different scores, but at least when it comes to non-magical weapons, they are all the same, so take the bottom of this list. Next up at number 9, we have necrotic damage. This is generally thought of as one of the better damage types, at least at the tables I've been in, but statistically it takes a lower spot, as there are 108 creatures who are resistant to it, 77 creatures who are immune to it, and only 2 who are vulnerable to it, giving it a score of 130. The conception that it's one of the better types of damage probably comes from the fact that monsters resistant or immune to it are not ones that are generally used at my tables. While one of you in the comments will tell me about how you were once in a game where every monster was immune to necrotic damage and that it was horrible. And at number 8, we have psychic damage. You may be surprised to see psychic so low on this list, as it's generally considered one of the better damage types. But it is so low because there are a lot of creatures that are immune to it. In fact, it is the 4th most common damage immunity, with 87 different creatures who are immune to it, with only 1 creature vulnerable, and 45 more that are resistant, so it clocks it at a score of 109. This puts it right at the top of the bottom half of the damage types, but despite its low score, there are a lot of great psychic damage spells, like Tasha's Mind Whip, Mind Spike, or even the classic cantrip that you know and love, Vicious Mockery. So, while you have to watch out for creatures who are immune to the damage, at least you have good ways of dealing the damage, which is not something you can say for the next spot on the list. Moving on to number 7, we have acid damage. This might be another surprising one, as things like Acid Splash Cantrip are kinda bad. But while there aren't many good spells that deal acid damage, there are only 76 creatures that are resistant to the damage, and 58 that are immune, with 1 that's vulnerable. This means its score is only 96, and of the 14 different damage types in 5th edition, it sits right at the bottom of the upper half, despite being in the lower part of this list. Outside of spells like Hunger of Hadar and Mel's Acid Arrow, you will be hard-pressed to find good sources of acid damage, as there are only 15 spells that deal acid damage. And of those, only 8 deal guaranteed acid damage, while the others just give you the option to choose acid for things like Chaos Bolt if you roll a die and that determines it. Still, while only at the number 7 spot on this list, it's a damage type more people should consider using. And at number 6, we have thunder damage, with only 58 creatures resistant to it and 19 immune, as well as 5 who are vulnerable. We're moving well into the double-digit scores now, as thunder damage comes in at 46. Which is the biggest drop yet, as it is 50 points better than acid. However, similarly to acid, there are very limited number of spells that actually deal thunder damage. However, while it is hard to find big damage spells like a thunder version of Fireball, there are a bunch of low-level thunder spells that are quite good. Things like Booming Blade, which is an excellent cantrip for melee casters. And while it didn't make the list, if you are interested in the best cantrips, you can check out my video on the top 10 best cantrips. It was the first video released on the channel. There are a couple of other good low-level thunder spells, like Thunderclap and Thunderous Smite, as well as a 3rd level spell, Thunderstep, which is basically the next step up in teleportation spells above the 2nd level Misty Step, but below the 4th level Dimension Door. The strongest straight thunder spell is the 5th level Destruction Wave spell, which deals 5d6 thunder and 5d6 radiant damage. But at 5th level, it's a bit underwhelming, and also half the damage isn't even thunder. Still, while the spells are few and far between, at least unlike acid damage, the spells it has are reasonably good. Starting the top half of this list at number 5, we have magical piercing damage. Now this may come as another surprise, but there are very few creatures that have resistance to this damage type. In fact, there are only 45 creatures that are resistant, and there are 0 that are either immune or vulnerable, so it has a score of 23. Exactly half the score that thunder damage got. Of the weapon damages, piercing is probably the easiest to deal, as pretty much all ranged weapons deal piercing damage, with the notable exception being the sling, which deals bludgeoning damage. This is also the only damage type that 0 creatures are immune to, so while you may run into creatures resistant to your +1 bow or rapier, there will be no creatures that will be immune to them, At least official creatures, your DM could always end up homebrewing a monster or just adding some extra immunities to an already existing one. And at number 4, we have magical slashing damage. Just like magical piercing, there are no creatures which are vulnerable to this type of damage, but there are 9 creatures who are immune to it. There is also 26 who are resistant, which is almost half the number who are resistant to magical piercing. Still, these 2 damage types are very similar, not just in that they come from weapons, but also in score. While magical piercing had a score of 23, magical slashing has a score of 22. So the addition of even a single new monster which is resistant to magical slashing damage would move this down to be tied with magical piercing damage. Now into the top 3. At the 3rd spot on this list, we have radiant damage. This is probably the least controversial spot on this list, as most people consider radiant damage to be good, and by the numbers, it is good. There are 22 creatures resistant to it, 11 creatures immune, and a massive 13 creatures vulnerable. While 13 might not seem like a lot, vulnerabilities are quite rare in 5th edition, and this is one of the only 3 damage types that have double-digit numbers of creatures who are vulnerable to it. And just like it takes the 3rd spot on this list, it is also the damage type that has the 3rd most creatures who are vulnerable to it. All this comes together and gives it a score of 16, which is pretty amazing. And there are some great spells out there that deal radiant damage too. From classic low-level spells like Sacred Flame and Guiding Bolt, all the way up to things like Sickening Radiance and Spirit Guardians, and for more info on why Spirit Guardians is good, you can check out my video on the top 10 4th level spells. And at number 2, we have Force Damage. I know this will be a shock to most of you, as this did not take the number 1 spot on this list, but there are 9 creatures resistant to Force Damage, 5 creatures immune, and 2 creatures who are vulnerable, which gives Force Damage a score of 9. Technically 8.5, but we're rounding it up to 9. Now, despite not taking the top spot, it is the least resisted damage type, and the only damage type that is resisted by a single-digit number of creatures. There are some great force damage spells too, things like Spiritual Weapon, which didn't make it into my top 10 2nd level spells video, but in the comments you all disagreed thinking it should have. Also, Dark Star from Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, and the best damaging cantrip in the game, Eldritch Blast, which did make it into my top 10 cantrips video, as well as Magic Missiles, which you can learn about in my top 10 1st level spells video. And while it may not be the best damage type, it is the best spell damage type, and will serve you well in almost every situation. Just try not to run into a room full of helmed horrors. Now, before we go to the number 1 spot, I want to go over the damage types that did not make the cut for the top 10, as there aren't enough to make a top 10 worst damage types video, and I refuse to lower myself to make top 5s as those are too low effort and means you didn't really try. So, the 4 damage types that didn't make the cut are lightning damage, with a score of 165, fire damage with a score of 217.5, rounded up to 218, cold damage with a score of 218, and by leaps and bounds the worst damage type of the game, as any of you could have guessed, poison damage with a score of 582. Fire is the damage type that the largest number of creatures are vulnerable to, but that doesn't help it too much as it is only half a point better than cold damage, because of just how many creatures are immune to it. Next to poison damage, fire damage is the most common damage immunity amongst creatures, while cold is the most common resistant damage type, followed by non-magical weapons. The reason lightning damage was beaten out by non-magical weapon damage is that it has nearly twice the number of creatures immune to it. Then there is poison damage. If you add up every damage immunity from every damage type in the game, except for cold damage, you only get to 538, which is still less than the 539 creatures that are immune to poison damage. It is insane the sheer number of creatures that are immune to poison, and is by far the worst damage type in the game. Back on track, at the number 1 spot, we have magical bludgeoning damage. I'm sure all of you are very surprised by this, but let me explain. While force damage had a score of 8.5, rounded up to 9, magical bludgeoning damage has a score of 8, and this is because of the number of creatures that are vulnerable to it. There are 36 creatures resistant to magical bludgeoning, and 22 who are vulnerable. After subtracting 1 from the other, we have 14, which divided by 2 is 7, and with only 1 creature who is immune to it, that being the mighty servant of Lecco, if we add that in, and come out with a score of 8, making magical bludgeoning damage the best type of damage in the game. Alright, and that's the video. Here is the chart. We calculated everything if you want to double check the math. Other than that, if you have ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.